The early morning sun cast long golden rays over the town of Mayfield, Alabama. The streets, still damp with dew, glistened softly as the town slowly began to stir. Mayfield wasn't a big place, nor was it particularly remarkable to outsiders. But for the people who called it home, every street corner, every porch, and every storefront carried years of memories. Sara Bennett stood on the front porch of her modest house, breathing in the cool morning air. She had just finished her breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, the same as every morning. The neighborhood around her was already beginning to hum with activity. Children in pressed uniforms walked hurriedly to school, and the distant sound of a church bell marked the passing of another hour. At 22, Sara was already well known in the community. Working as a nurse at the Mayfield Medical Clinic, she had cared for the young and old alike. Her mother had once told her that kindness was the strongest medicine, and Sara took that to heart. She wasn't rich, nor did she have dreams of leaving Mayfield behind. She loved her town, even with all its unspoken rules and quiet divisions. She tied her hair into a neat bun, adjusted her light blue uniform, and grabbed her worn leather bag. Today, like every day, she would walk the 3 blocks to the clinic, ready to help anyone who needed her. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she nodded politely to Mr. Jenkins, the elderly postman, who had delivered letters on the same route for as long as she could remember. "Morning, Sara," he greeted with a smile, tipping his hat. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," she replied warmly. The walk to the clinic was familiar. She passed the bakery where the smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, the small grocery store run by the Patel family, and the old movie theater that rarely changed its marquee. It read, "Tonight, The Great Escape." She had seen the poster in town for weeks, but never found the time to go. At the clinic, Sara slipped into her daily routine. She greeted the receptionist, Mrs. Hill, and quickly checked the day's patient list. The morning passed in a blur, tending to coughs, fevers, and the usual ailments that filled the waiting room. She moved from patient to patient with practiced ease, offering gentle words and steady hands. During her short lunch break, she sat by the window sipping sweet tea from a glass jar. The street outside was busy now, people moving in and out of shops, children chasing each other on the sidewalks. From where she sat, Sara could see the town's bus stop across the street. Buses came and went, carrying workers, shoppers, and families trying to get to the other side of town. The bus stop had always been a quiet reminder of the town's unspoken lines. 2 benches stood side by side, but everyone knew which one to sit on. Sara often watched as people avoided eye contact, careful to follow the unwritten rules without question. She sighed softly and turned back to her tea, trying not to let the weight of it all settle too deeply on her heart. By late afternoon, the clinic began to slow down. Mrs. Hill waved her over. "Looks like we're done for the day, dear. Go on home and get some rest." Sara smiled and gathered her things. "Thank you, Mrs. Hill. See you tomorrow." Stepping back onto the street, she decided to take the bus home instead of walking. It wasn't far, but after a long day on her feet, the thought of sitting down for a few minutes was tempting. She crossed the street and approached the bus stop. A few people were already waiting, standing apart from one another as usual. Sara knew the routine. She had followed it all her life. The bus pulled up with a soft hiss, the door creaking open. Sara climbed the steps, dropping her fare into the coin box. She glanced around the bus. Most of the seats were empty. She walked toward the middle, her feet moving almost on their own, as if guided by habit. She chose a seat on the left side, by the window, and placed her bag on her lap. The bus rumbled back to life, moving slowly down the street. Sara leaned her head against the window, watching the town roll by. A few stops later, more passengers boarded. Among them was a tall man in a gray suit, holding a briefcase. He paused near Sara's seat, his eyes narrowing slightly. Without a word, he turned to the driver. Sara felt the shift in the air before she heard the words. "Driver, she's in the wrong section." The driver A stocky man with tired eyes glanced into the rearview mirror. "Miss, you'll need to move to the back." Sarah's heart began to pound in her chest. She knew this moment had come before for others. She had heard the stories, whispered in the clinic and around dinner tables. But now it was her turn. She looked down at her hands, gripping the leather strap of her bag tightly. Every instinct told her to stand up, to move without causing trouble. That was what people expected. That was how things had always been. But something held her in place. A small, quiet voice inside her whispered that maybe today could be different. Sara lifted her head and met the driver's gaze in the mirror. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said softly, her voice steady but quiet. The bus seemed to hold its breath. Passengers turned to look, some wide-eyed, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The driver sighed, clearly wishing this wasn't happening on his route today. "Miss, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sara swallowed hard. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down like a heavy blanket. She thought of her mother's words, of kindness being the strongest medicine. But kindness didn't mean silence. She took a deep breath and spoke again, louder this time. "I paid my fare. I'm not moving." A murmur spread through the bus. The man in the gray suit tightened his grip on his briefcase, his jaw clenched. The driver stood up slowly, his face set with frustration. "Miss, I'm going to have to call the authorities if you don't move." Sarah's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't stand. She knew the risks. She knew what could happen. But she also knew that if she moved now, she might never forgive herself. The bus came to a slow stop at the corner of Oak and Jefferson. The driver walked to the nearest payphone, leaving the passengers in stunned silence. Sara stared out the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. She wondered what her mother would say if she were here. She wondered if she was doing the right thing. But deep down, she already knew the answer. The first step had been taken. There was no turning back now. The air inside the bus grew heavy as Sara sat in silence, staring out the window. She could feel the passengers shifting uncomfortably behind her, their whispered conversations filling the space with tension. Some glanced toward the front of the bus, anxious to see what the driver would do next. Others avoided looking at her at all, as if pretending not to notice might keep them out of trouble. The driver returned a few minutes later, his face tight with frustration. He climbed back into his seat and started the engine again, but the atmosphere remained charged. The man in the gray suit didn't sit down. He stood near the front, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sara knew what was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The authorities would be waiting at the next stop, and she would have to answer for what she had done. The bus rolled to a stop at the corner of Main and Harrison, right in front of the town's small police station. As the doors creaked open, 2 uniformed officers stood waiting on the sidewalk. They stepped onto the bus, their eyes landing on Sara almost immediately. "Miss, we need you to come with us," one of them said, his voice firm but not unkind. Sara felt her heart race. She clutched her bag tightly, standing up slowly. The bus remained silent, every passenger holding their breath. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt a wave of emotions: fear, anger, and something else she couldn't quite name. She turned toward the officer, meeting his gaze. "I paid my fare," she said softly, as if reminding herself as much as anyone else. "We know," the officer replied, his expression unreadable. "Please, miss, let's not make this harder." With quiet dignity, Sara followed the officers off the bus. She could feel the eyes of every passenger on her back as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The door hissed closed behind her, and the bus pulled away, leaving her standing in the shadow of the police station. Inside, the small lobby smelled faintly of old coffee and cigarette smoke. A single fan hummed in the corner, barely cutting through the thick afternoon heat. The officers led her to a wooden bench near the front desk. "Wait here," one of them instructed, before walking toward the back. Sara sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she placed her bag on her lap. She stared at the floor, trying to steady her breathing. She had never been in trouble before. Not like this. After what felt like hours, a tall man in a dark suit approached her. He introduced himself as Officer Daniels, the station supervisor. "Miss Bennett, is that correct?" he asked, sitting down across from her. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. He studied her for a moment, then leaned forward, folding his hands together. "You understand why you're here, don't you?" Sara nodded slowly. "Because I didn't move." He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Miss Bennett, you put the driver in a difficult position. You put yourself in one too. Now, I understand you might feel you've made a point, but this town has rules. You know that." Sara felt her throat tighten. Rules that aren't fair. Officer Daniels pressed his lips into a thin line. "Fair or not, they keep the peace, and breaking them only causes trouble, for you and everyone else." She felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down. "I didn't hurt anyone," she whispered. He rubbed his chin, as if weighing his words carefully. "No, you didn't, but some folks won't see it that way." Sara lowered her eyes, staring at the floor again. She knew he was right. She had seen how quickly things could turn bad in Mayfield. After a long pause, Officer Daniels stood up. "You're free to go for now, but I suggest you think very carefully about what you're doing, Miss Bennett. People around here don't like troublemakers." Sara nodded, standing slowly. "Thank you, sir." She gathered her things and walked out of the station, the sun now lower in the sky. The streets felt different, quieter, heavier. Word would spread quickly. She knew that much. As she walked home, she passed neighbors who usually smiled and waved. Today, they only watched in silence. Some turned their backs. Others crossed to the other side of the street. When she reached her house, she paused on the porch, gripping the railing as if to steady herself. Inside, her younger sister, Lillian, peeked through the window, her face full of worry. Sara forced a smile and opened the door. Lillian rushed of her. "Sara, what happened? I heard someone at the market say you got taken to the station." Sara set her bag down and hugged her sister tightly. "I'm fine, Lil. I'll tell you everything." They sat together in the small living room, the fading light casting long shadows on the walls. Sara recounted the events on the bus, the officers, and Officer Daniels' warning. Lillian listened with wide eyes, clutching Sara's hand the whole time. "Are you scared?" Lillian whispered when Sara finished. Sara nodded slowly. "Yes, but I had to do it. I couldn't stay quiet anymore." That night, Sara lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with what might come next. Would she lose her job? Would people stop coming to the clinic? Would someone try to hurt her or her family? But even with all the fears swirling inside her, she felt something else, something stronger. A quiet sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time, she felt like she was walking towards something that mattered. Something that could change everything. And she wasn't ready to turn back now. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Sara's bedroom. She had barely slept, her thoughts spinning like a wheel that refused to stop. Every word Officer Daniels had spoken echoed in her mind. She knew the risk, yet she also knew there was no way she could take back what she had done. In the kitchen, Lillian was already making breakfast, 2 slices of toast and a pot of tea. Sara appreciated the effort, though she had little appetite. She sat at the small wooden table, wrapping her hands around the warm mug, searching for comfort in the simple ritual. Lillian sat across from her, watching with worried eyes. "Do you think they'll come back, the officers?" Sara shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but I don't think it's over." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. After finishing her tea, Sara dressed in her uniform and tied her hair back. She knew staying home would only fuel more gossip. She had to show the town she wasn't afraid. Grabbing her bag, she kissed Lillian on the forehead and stepped outside. The walk to the clinic felt longer than usual. People stood on their perches, their conversations falling silent as she passed. Some nodded stiffly. Others turned their backs. When she reached the clinic, she paused at the door. Taking a deep breath before stepping inside, Mrs. Hill looked up from the reception desk, her face unreadable. "Morning, Sara," she said softly, almost hesitantly. "Morning," Sara replied, forcing a small smile. The day started much like any other. Patients filled the waiting room, and Sara focused on her work, refusing to let her mind wander. She cleaned wounds, checked fevers, and offered the same kindness she always had. But something was different. The way people looked at her. The way some avoided her touch. The whispered conversations just out of earshot. By lunchtime, Mrs. Hill approached her in the hallway. "Sara, could you come into my office for a moment?" Sara nodded, following her. Inside, Mrs. Hill closed the door and sat down behind her desk. She folded her hands on the surface, her expression heavy with something that looked like regret. "Sara, I received a few phone calls this morning," she began slowly. "Some folks in town aren't happy about what happened." Mrs. Hill sighed. "They're asking the clinic to let you go. They say you're bringing too much attention, making people uncomfortable." Sara felt the words like a punch to the chest. "Are you going to?" Mrs. Hill leaned back, looking down at her hands. "I don't want to. You're one of the best we have. But the board meets tomorrow, and I can't promise what they'll decide." Sara nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs." Hill stood and walked around the desk, placing a hand on Sara's shoulder. "For what it's worth, I think you did something brave. But not everyone sees it that way." Sara nodded again, unable to find the right words. The rest of the day dragged on like a heavy storm cloud. By the time she finished her shift, Sara felt drained, both physically and emotionally. She walked home in silence, the weight of uncertainty pressing down with every step. That evening, as she sat on the porch, a car pulled up in front of the house. Out stepped Mr. Carter, one of the town's newspaper editors. Sara watched him cautiously as he approached. "Miss Bennett," he greeted with a polite nod. "May I have a word?" Sara stood, folding her arms across her chest. "What is it?" Mr. Carter glanced around, lowering his voice. "I heard what happened on the bus. Some folks say you caused trouble. Others say you showed courage. I'd like to hear your side." Sara raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He adjusted his glasses. "Because I think the town deserves to hear the whole story, not just the whispers." She hesitated. The idea of her story in the newspaper made her stomach turn. What would her neighbors think? What if it made things worse? But then she remembered Mrs. Hill's words. Someone had to speak the truth. "All right," Sara said quietly. "Come back tomorrow evening. I'll tell you everything." Mr. Carter nodded. "I'll be here." As he drove away, Lillian came outside, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool night air. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Sara looked out over the empty street, her heart pounding. "No, but if I stay silent, they win." And she wasn't ready to let that happen. The next day passed in slow motion. Every tick of the clock seemed louder than usual, marking the hours as Sara went through the motions of her work at the clinic. She barely noticed the whispers, the sideways glances, or the cold silence from some of her patients. Her mind was occupied with what would happen later that evening when Mr. Carter returned. When her shift ended, Mrs. Hill caught her by the arm as she was gathering her things. "The board meets tomorrow," Mrs. Hill told her. Hill said quietly, as if saying it too loudly would make it more real. "I still don't know what they'll decide, but I thought you should know." Sara nodded, offering a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Hill." The walk home felt heavier than the day before. The tension in town hadn't eased. It had settled like a thick fog. She wondered how many people had heard by now. How many supported her silently, and how many waited for her to fail? By the time Mr. Carter's car pulled up in front of her house, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. Sara stood on the porch, waiting as he stepped out of the vehicle with a small notepad in hand. "Miss Bennett," he greeted her again, just as politely as the night before. "Come on in," Sara replied, holding the door open. Lillian sat quietly at the kitchen table as Mr. Carter took a seat across from Sara. He opened his notepad, clicked his pen, and waited for her to begin. Sara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I was just trying to get home after work," she began, recounting the events of that day. The bus ride, the confrontation, the police station, and the growing tension in town. Mr. Carter listened intently, jotting down notes but never interrupting. When she finished, he looked up, studying her face for a moment. "Why did you choose not to move?" he asked gently. Sara hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I was tired," she finally said. "Not just from work, but from pretending that following unfair rules was the only way to live. I wanted to show myself, and maybe someone else, that it's okay to say no." Mr. Carter nodded slowly. "You understand the risk of printing your story, don't you?" Sara nodded. "I do." He closed his notebook and stood. "I'll do my best to tell it fairly. The paper comes out on Friday." As he left, Lillian reached across the table and squeezed Sara's hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Sara smiled, though her heart still felt heavy with uncertainty. The next day, the board at the clinic met behind closed doors. Sara waited outside the office, listening to the muffled voices inside. After what felt like hours, Mrs. Hill emerged, her expression unreadable. "They've decided to suspend you for 2 weeks," she said softly. "No pay. They say it's to let things calm down." Sara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I understand, Mrs." Hill reached out and took her hand. "I hope you'll come back after that. This town needs people like you, whether they realize it or not." Sara left the clinic with her bag feeling heavier than usual. 2 weeks without work. 2 weeks of wondering what would happen next. On Friday morning, the town's newspaper hit the stands. The front page read, "Local nurse takes a stand on Mayfield bus." Sara's story was laid out in simple, clear language. Mr. Carter had kept his word, telling it without twisting her actions or motives. The article ended with a question. What kind of town do we want to be? Sara didn't leave the house that day. She sat by the window, watching as people passed by, some with newspapers folded under their arms, others stopping to talk in hushed tones. That evening, there was a knock at the door. Lillian opened it to find the woman standing on the porch, Mrs. Patterson, one of Sara's former patients. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said quietly. "You did something I never had the courage to do." One by one, over the next hour, others came. Some stayed only long enough to nod or leave a kind word. Others stayed longer, sitting on the porch talking softly about change, about fear, and about hope. Sara realized then that she wasn't as alone as she had felt. There were others who had been waiting for someone to take the first step. Now they were ready to take the next one together. And the real journey was only beginning. In the days that followed the newspaper article, Mayfield seemed to stand at a crossroads. Some streets were filled with tense silence, while others buzzed with quiet conversations that hinted at a shift too small to name, but too big to ignore. Sara kept mostly to herself during her suspension, unsure of what kind of reception she would face if she stepped out too boldly. Yet, every evening, neighbors she had known for years, and some she hadn't, came by to offer a kind word or simply to sit with her in companionable silence on the porch. One evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Mr. Carter returned. This time, he wasn't alone. With him were two men and a woman, all of whom introduced themselves as part of a small community group working quietly for change in nearby towns. "We've been following your story," the woman said, "and we think Mayfield might be ready to hear more." Sara listened as they explained their idea. Small gatherings, private at first, to share stories like hers. No speeches, no shouting. Just neighbors talking to neighbors, slowly peeling back the fear that had ruled the town for so long. Sara agreed, though doubt still tugged at the edges of her heart. Could simple conversations really change anything? The first meeting was held in the back room of the town's old library. 10 people showed up. Some Sara recognized from the clinic. Others were strangers. They sat in a circle, hesitant at first. But as the night wore on, the words began to flow. Sara shared her experience on the bus, her fears, and the heavy silence that had followed. Others shared their own stories of moments when they had stayed quiet, or times they had spoken up and paid the price. The meetings continued, growing slowly in number. More people came, some bringing friends or family. What started as quiet gatherings soon turned into real conversations about what kind of town Mayfield could become. One afternoon, Mrs. Hill visited Sara at home. "The board has decided to reinstate you," she announced with a tired but genuine smile. Not everyone was happy about it, but enough people spoke up. They had no choice but to listen. Sara felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you for standing by me," Mrs. Hill nodded. "The real thanks belong to you, Sara. You lit the spark." Returning to the clinic felt different this time. The glances were still there, but so were the smiles. People greeted her with cautious hope, as if they too were testing the waters of a new beginning. Weeks turned into months, and though progress was slow, it was steady. The conversations continued, and small changes began to appear around town. The 2 benches at the bus stop, once silent symbols of division, now held people who dared to sit wherever they pleased. One crisp autumn morning, Sara stood at that very bus stop, waiting for the familiar old bus to arrive. When it did, she climbed aboard, dropping her fare into the coin box as always. This time, she walked down the aisle and chose a seat, any seat she wanted. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, but said nothing. The other passengers barely reacted. It was just another day. Sara leaned back in her seat, a small smile playing on her lips. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face. But for the first time, she truly believed that Mayfield was changing, and that maybe, just maybe, she had helped it take the first step towards something better. The bus rolled on, carrying her forward into whatever came next.